Cybercriminals are opportunistically targeting industries that continue to operate full tilt during the coronavirus shutdowns, and their attacks have grown more sophisticated. Given this shifting landscape, taking the appropriate countermeasures becomes paramount. Mimecast Email Security 3.0 helps you evolve from a perimeter-based security strategy to one that is comprehensive and pervasive with cyber resiliency in mind. From the company that stops at nothing to block cyber threats, Mimecast is offering a fully featured 90-day web security service. Visit securityweekly.com/Mimecast to learn more. Uptycs has built a platform for SQL-powered security analytics. Extending the OS query agent, Uptycs collects, aggregates, and analyzes a wide range of system data and makes that available to solve multiple security challenges. Their solution provides visibility across Linux, macOS, Windows, containers, and cloud workloads. Their customers are using the Uptycs platform for fleet visibility, intrusion detection, investigation, and audit and compliance. Visit securityweekly.com/Uptycs and be one of the first to see how they've mapped over 500 behavioral rules to the MITRE ATT&CK framework. Welcome back to Enterprise Security Weekly. Tune in tomorrow, February 4th at 11 a.m. Eastern Time in our first technical training of 2021. You'll learn how to manage insider risks in the work from anywhere world. Register at securityweekly.com/webcasts. If you missed any of our previous webcasts, you can go to securityweekly.com/on-demand. Jonathan Cran joins us to discuss what can be done to get a handle on the ever-growing attack surface of the enterprise. Jonathan, welcome.
Thanks. Great to be here, Paul.
It's nice to have you. You've been in the security industry for some time.
Yes.
You worked at Rapid7, you worked at BugCrowd, you worked at Kenna Security, and you decided to go off and basically do your own thing. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct.
It's awesome. Yeah, congrats, man.
Thanks.
It's a big step. Now,
it is a big step. Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say, so the space you've decided to go in is one that Adrian and I have actually started researching very, very much so. And the first question we have, we're like, attack surface management, attack surface monitoring, and attack surface mapping. Are those like all the same thing, different? Like, what's your take on it, having a startup in this space?
Yeah, I would say it's all shades of similar things. The way I look at it, there's a discovery component to it, and that's discovery of assets. There's a discovery of exposures component to it, and then there's like a continuous monitoring component to it as well.
I've always felt, Jonathan, that you could go get some pretty good, actually some really great open source tools and kind of stitch this thing together yourself. Like BugCrowd, I know you work there. Like if you're a bug bounty hunter, you've got your own like little tool set basically that when you go after a bounty, you're looking for that attack surface as a starting point. What are some of the like pros and cons of this open source technologies for doing it yourself?
Yeah, really, really good question, and I think that's where a lot of folks start with this. There's just tons of good sources out there on the OSINT side. You look at things like Shodan, and kind of these repositories of data, and you look at all the emerging and still pretty small sources of data as well. Things like Grey Hat Warfare, C99. Security trails, like there's just a bunch of folks that are collecting pools of data, but those the data doesn't tend to be completely overlapping, and so you really need to kind of like, if you're building it from scratch and kind of building it yourself, you kind of want to do some discovery yourself, and you kind of want to do some discovery based on pulling data from these APIs. And so we approach that problem in pretty similar to that, kind of being integration first and trying to pull all the different pieces from all the best APIs, as well as supplement that with additional data, coming from internal. We don't try to be like the all-in-one data solution, just because there's so many different good sources and it's evolving so quickly that to really tackle the problem completely, you really do need to be integration first and kind of like use the best of the best sources.
And you end up with a lot of API keys to manage.
Yeah. No question. I mean, that's definitely part of the challenge is just literally managing those API keys, but also kind of like monitoring usage, making sure that you have enough calls. And when you think about it, when you find something, you want to check all the different sources. And so you're reusing those keys a lot. And so, that just becomes part of the challenge.
And those keys are limited. I mean, much like any API, because you're registering with a key, they monitor how many calls you're making, right? And it's metered, right? And you got to get around that.
Yep. Some are better than others. I mean,
Mm.
and we sort of take this approach of we want to use all of those sources, but also do it ourselves for cases like that. But also we're going to find different things than a Shodan, for instance.
Mm.
One thing kind of like worth calling out too is it's not just port scanning. It's not just web app scanning. It's not just DAST. It's like a very whole. What I like about this space is that it's a very holistic approach to the problem. There's every day it seems like there's a new type of thing that you want to be monitoring. There's GitHub, there's AWS, there's the actual traditional network. But I think one interesting way to define the space is to say like it starts from a world where everything's software defined, and so you really have to start with DNS.
Mm.
And you have to kind of go from there. And DNS will lead you down the path of like, oh, that's a GitLab instance. Well, what do we know about GitLab? And is that thing up to date? And well, there's a Jira instance, and like, has this thing been updated? And what's the configuration of it look like? And you really have to be good at kind of figuring out what a thing is. And actually, like maybe even a better way to say it is to say like, attack surface management is really all about figuring out what's out there for a given organization, figuring out what it's running, from a software perspective and from a configuration perspective, and then looking for those exposures on those, whether it's configuration, whether it's vulnerability, that sort of thing. And like that's such a huge challenge that I think this space, it evolves into like deep partnerships with vulnerability management. It evolves into partnership with asset management. It's like, but really what you're trying to do is pull together the gaps and show, the pieces that would be traditionally missed with traditional solutions.
Yeah, and it's a big. I think the reason we've seen a lot of new companies and new open source projects is because it's becoming a longer and longer task. Like many of us remember back in the day, go back 15, 20 years, you'd be like, all right, I'm going to go enumerate DNS. I'm going to enumerate off of that, take some screenshots. Like I got a pretty good handle on what the exposure is. This is before AWS, right? Yeah. But now you go down a rabbit hole, man. Like I've been looking at some of that for our own company, pretty recently acquired, and we've got like a lot of different domains, and like, wow, this could be a really big rabbit hole. Like, what do we have out there? And you look at DNS, and I was using AMAS for DNS. In fact, I've been in contact with Jeff Foley. Cool. We're trying to bring him on the show as well, because they've done a great job with that project. But that just is like the beginning of your rabbit hole. And then like, how do you manage all of these tools? And then you're looking at open source frameworks, and now you're looking at commercial tools. And the ultimate goal is to have that iterative process, right? Like you explore the rabbit hole, but now you need to like rinse, lather, repeat, right? How do you do that well? Is that one of the goals of your company?
Yeah. So awesome that you mentioned open source. We started from an open source core, and that's the reason. Like, it was a big jump to start the company, but it really wasn't that big of a jump. We've been kind of like working on this project for 5 years now, and it's cool because there's like a team coming together, and we can actually like start to fund the team now, which is cool.
Nice.
And so it really is that iterative idea. It's like baked into the concept of it. So it's made of a couple things, right? We call it Intrigue Core, and it's an entity system. And I say entities, and Tyler will probably, I hope he agrees with me on this. Like, it's really about breaking things down into their most decomposable parts. You could call it an asset or an entity. They're almost interchangeable, but the way we approach the problem is we try to go to the most decomposable thing you can possibly get and define it. So an example of that is like define an IP address instead of defining a host, which could have multiple IP addresses. A host is like a combination of IP addresses in DNS. And so the core engine is made of these entities, and then tasks, which if you're familiar with like Maltego, it's kind of similar to that concept of like, you put an entity into a Maltego would call them a transform, we call them tasks, and it does one thing, it does it really well. An example of that is like it's a port scan, or just even DNS resolution's a pretty common task, but it gets as exotic as like saying, run a git rob, or against a GitHub entity. And so you can kind of build this arbitrary complexity out of these things. And so we just released actually the open source side workflows in a YAML defined way. So you can come in and build these like custom workflows to go discover entities, and then just run that on a continuous basis. And you might have a workflow that's specific to your cloud assets. You might have a workflow that's specific to your GitHub and your kind of like software assets. And then you might have one that's more traditional in finding kind of like network scans. But taking these things together, these entities, these tasks, and these workflows, you can really build those discovery capabilities, and that's what the core engine does. It just discovers things. Now we wrap around to that for the hosted platform and make it continuous and make it easy and kind of simplify the process a bunch. But really, the bulk of the capability of the platform is open source, and we built it that way on purpose. Like, we think that's the right way to build the platform.
And so that's your plan, is to continue having an open source side and a commercial side, and keep those in conjunction.
Absolutely, yeah. Open core model all the way. The nice thing about that is it gets us like deep, the ability to work with the community as new techniques and new ideas come out. We can kind of like work with them, and it's just more fun this way too.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. But I like this approach. Having a vulnerability management background, it makes this very interesting, because I'm like, I know I'm going to run vulnerability scans, right? But there's usually this like core set of things that I'm like, tell me if this asset like ever goes away, or tell me if this asset changed its configuration in a very specific way. Yeah. And I've got like this core set of these, and I'm like, yeah, I know I'm going to run all those vulnerability scans and blah, blah, blah. But like, there's just like super important core set of things. Like, tell me if my XML RPC is ever exposed or usable on my WordPress site, because it should never be. Yep. However, developers go in and do stuff. There's a WordPress upgrade. My hosting provider changes something. We update PH, whatever it is, all of a sudden becomes available, right? Now, I've actually, in this case, this is something I would monitor for. I've gone in and added a redirect. And I'm like, anyone hitting that goes to this page. And then I've put, actually, now that everyone knows this, everyone's going to hit it, right? There's a canary token that sends me an email. Now I'm probably going to have to change it, right? Whenever anyone hits that, right?
Yeah, be right back.
Exactly. But like, I want my attack surface management to go like, this should be the state and always be the state. And if that state changes, please tell me. That's kind of what I feel is a good, powerful thing in this space.
I agree. And I'll just give you a couple examples. One of the folks that we ended up working with early on, they got bit by, they had opened a port to one of their like traditional data center networks on port 80, and swapped the backend asset out for an ESXi server. And it eventually ended up exposing their ESXi configuration unauthenticated to the internet. And that was the impetus for like, hey, we should really be like monitoring this stuff more closely. Now, you might catch that with a regular vulnerability scanner, but I think in this case they didn't, for whatever reason. And it gets as complicated as saying like, we want to monitor all of our domains for typo squats.
Yep.
We want to be constantly looking for sort of permutations of a given domain, and seeing if they resolve, and see if they resolve to something that we don't know. And so when something like that pops up, we want to be notified. And probably another example, actually one that came up this morning in a large government provider, was just WordPress configuration. Somebody made a backup file on the system, and of course, because the backup file is not named .php, the PHP interpreter doesn't find it. So there's your AWS keys, because they were in that file, as well as the actual system database configuration, which like that leans toward vulnerability.
Yeah,
but these are easy things to look for. And so once you're finding all these assets, which we would have never found that asset without DNS, because it's not on their network, we might as well look for these simple exposures. But really, we think the best thing is to hand that off to the vulnerability scanner once we found it and confirmed that an asset actually belongs to you.
I think of this as, Jonathan, the more we both give examples, is it's really unit testing for my external for my infrastructure, right? I think of it more like when I write code and I make a lot of mistakes, and like, we should have a unit test to make sure Paul doesn't make that mistake again. It's the same thing for your attack surface. It's basically your unit testing and that's so much, it's different. My unit tests are different than my web application scanner. They do different things, right? And I feel like this is the unit test for your infrastructure.
Yep, completely agree. And the kind of interesting thing is like that discovery component, can you unit test something that's not on your network?
Right.
Like, you have to first find it, verify that it's yours, and then you can put it into this process of continuous monitoring.
Tyler, Adrian, sorry, I've been commandeering the conversation here.
Yep.
No, So quick question for you, Jonathan. I've known Jonathan forever. We're good friends, and I love what he's doing at Intrigue. But what's interesting to me, from a technology perspective, I love that you're kind of targeting kind of the cyber asset, cyber entity, whatever it ends up being as far as the market goes. But you're taking a super deep technical view into that, and I think it's neat in the market. What made you come up with this idea? Like, what's the founding story of it, right? I mean, were you sitting at a table with a buddy and saying, hey, let's do this idea, or how did it come around?
Yeah, really good question. And yeah, we've known each other for a long time. So you've seen kind of evolve and definitely like, I've been in the space for a long, long time, as Paul mentioned at the beginning of the segment. And, the early ideas came from pen testing, at Rapid7. Then they sort of evolved with Bug Bounty at BugCrowd. And they evolved, even further when I was at Cana most recently. Like every, this, in the end, it's a fundamental problem of, the security practitioner is finding what you own, figuring out what's on it, and figuring out what's at most risk. And so, this deep technical view kind of comes from an understanding that the world has been moving to a software-defined, state. Assets and entities, like whatever you want to call it, there is no such thing as an entity system that just works for cybersecurity anymore. We have to keep evolving it over time. And so we need to have this like really flexible system. And if we can build that open source and start to get people, to where they're thinking about these things and using it for discovery, I think that's like a super cool mission, and it's definitely been a mission over the last few years. Yeah,
and the approach really does take kind of a security engineering approach to the problem, right? Allow your buyers, customers, and free users from the open source side to truly embrace it and take a security engineering approach to it and evolve it. Exactly right. What's the long-term vision for the commercial side of the company then? How do you match with that?
Yeah. I mean, I think we stay open core and we build as much as we can on the discovery side, open source. And if you want to go and build automation around it for your own organization, by all means, go do it. We're BSD licensed and open for commercial use too. But really, we think the hosted platform makes it easy for folks. It makes it easy to put your own API keys in. It makes it easy to plug into your own infrastructure, because like the only way to really solve this problem is to not you can't just take a black box uninformed approach to this. You have to actually inform it with additional information, with plugging it into your DNS, with plugging it into your cloud accounts to pull that information as what we call seeds or verified entities out, so that we can continuously iterate on that. And so the evolution of the platform is really moving into something that's easier to use, that is searchable. So you're not, continuously having to wait for that new information, that you always have information available to you, and it's plugging into your system so that you can completely solve the problem.
And so this follow-on question is going to be a weird one. Does this help? Because it's a continuous assessment of external and internal potentially threats. Does this help solve compliance evidence collection long-term? Meaning, does it turn compliance from a one-shot thing to a continuous assessment model, which, quite frankly, that's the difference between compliance and security. Compliance is one-shot, security is doing it constantly, right?
Yeah.
So is this kind of a governance tool, or do you think it leans more towards threat landscape over time?
Well, I think I'd actually watched a segment where the three of you were talking about this. I think it was a couple of weeks ago, and kind of I think there was a thing that maybe even you said, Tyler, where it's like you have to be good at the external side, you have to be good at the internal side, and then you have to have this like governance management component. And there's a lot of challenge there. That's a big task. And so what we're really focused on is the external side for now, and plugging in and making sure that we have a full picture of DNS. While I think there's enough of a challenge in the cloud side, in the governance side, that we'll evolve into that over time, and hopefully we can collaborate with our partners and make that happen.
Yeah, it's super amazing work you and the team are doing. It's been fun to watch over the years. I've known about it for quite a while. So, Adrian, Thanks. Did you have any questions you want to ask?
Yeah, actually, and I've been watching this product and testing it out over the years as well. It's been a lot of fun watching it evolve.
Thank you.
And yeah, just back when I used to pen test, and those of us who have done pen testing or even just played with Maltego, I think Maltego was a big one for me, because it actually allowed you to kind of visualize what the rabbit hole looked like when you went down it, when you broke everything into entities. And and I don't think I ever had an occasion to really fully go down all the rabbit holes to flesh it out, because you get to a point where it's not even usable in that graphical format, or you've got to do pieces at a time or something like that.
Yep.
And just thinking of, I remember when, the Equifax breach was unfolding, and what everybody latched onto was, why couldn't they just patch this struts issue? And it really came down to, at least that initial infection vector came down to Equifax employees trying to find it, a race between them and the bad guys. And the bad guys won that race because they didn't know their infrastructure. It was a legacy system. And I remember looking up and tweeting about this, that there were Equifax owned something like 76,000 plus routable IPs. I don't know how many were in use, but that was their IP landscape. And at that scale, the tools like this, you start to hit issues at certain scale. Do you have to, kind of build it, or look at the problem a bit differently once you start getting to really big scale?
Yeah, good question. A couple different pieces of that. The platform, the way we built it in the core engine, was built to scale horizontally. So basically, like, there's a bunch of background workers that are talking to a Postgres and a Redis, and so even the core engine, the open source side, will scale up to millions of entities. We're kind of working on that over the course of the next year. We really haven't tapped it out at this point, but we think that there are people that we're working with that want to go bigger. So what I would say is, like, graph, and I'm like toying with this idea of calling it non-linear discovery, because you're not just like going out and scanning individual networks or checking just a set of things. Like, you're constantly recombining it, which can be pretty intensive. So we built the graph database like from scratch on top of Postgres. We started this a few years ago, so like we've been tuning that thing over and over and over again through every release. And so it gets big.
And my question isn't so much about technically scaling it. I'm sure you can technically scale it. My concern is more on the, Nexpose tells me I have 250,000 critical vulnerabilities. I quit. That's where Kenna comes in. So I do see a parallel between what Kenna's doing for vulnerability management and potentially the need for that arising in what you're doing here with attack surface monitoring, where I've got 76,000 public IPs. Yes, it found all the entities, but now it's telling me at the highest level of criticality here, I've got hundreds of thousands of things to go fix or to go inspect and work on. So that's more the scale problem that I'm thinking of.
Yeah. A couple thoughts on that. Like, number one is, like, prioritization is a hard problem to solve generically. The way Ken approaches it, and kind of like the industry's evolving to this idea of like threat informed prioritization and risk informed prioritization. Asset value plus is it actively under attack? Those two things kind of informing that first step. But another thing I would say is, like, I don't think we've fully solved. I don't think anybody's fully solved automated asset prioritization. But what I will say is this idea of collecting it as a graph and showing the interconnections and keeping track of all the different interconnections as you find entities is something that I think is fundamental, and I think we're going to continue to explore over the next couple of years. But if you've got an asset that's interconnected into your infrastructure through a bunch of different paths, we're finding that those tend to be more high value assets. So that's one way that we can start to solve that automated prioritization problem. In the end, the prioritization really comes down to which assets make you money. And there's always going to be a human element to that. But the more we can do to kind of elevate those things to the user, I think the better.
Okay.
Yeah, Jonathan, you said something interesting earlier that I discovered, like, with my background in pen testing. And then I started looking at my own assets. And I was like, all right, well, I'm going to do these tests. And I'm like, wait a minute, dummy. I don't have to approach it like a black box pen test anymore. Like, I have access to the DNS records. I have access to my cloud resources. I should basically use a supervised model versus an unsupervised model. And you can kind of coach our audience on that. And, like, in this realm of attack surface management, it's not a black box test. It's a collaboration, right?
You can do a domain transfer.
Yes, you
Yeah.
can,
Yeah,
absolutely.
exactly.
It's totally cool.
Yeah, and sometimes we'll do it for unauthenticated reasons. The thinking there is like we should always start uninformed if we don't have any credentials, and like if you're just getting started, it's often helpful to do that. And there's no reason you shouldn't run an uninformed next to an informed and sort of see what the diff looks like. Too, and it's kind of built to do that. We have this concept of collections, and you can run them in parallel. And in the end, like we'll use credentials over here where we have them, and not over here where we don't. It's useful. Both perspectives are useful. If you can only do one, like my preference is always to do informed, just because it's like, the more information you have, the better in general. Of course, the prioritization problem that Adrian's mentioning is real. But it's definitely one of those things where I think it's an evolution that you should go through as you do more and more testing. The more you're doing this on a regular basis, I think you're probably going to find yourself entering more credentials. But then again, you've got acquisitions, you've got different teams in different places. You may not have access to their infrastructure, and that's something we find a lot. So it's not always so cut and dry.
Yeah, it's really, you'll be surprised what you discover. Now, folks can get the open source component of this and start testing. What does that look like to like get it and get set up? Yeah,
it's actually cool. I really like kind of what we've done here. So we're actively in the process, kind of reworking the hosted platform now. Now that we're all full time, we're spending a lot more time on it. But we're actually today, you can go to intrigue.io, create an account, automatic, like self sign up, and then if we have information about your organization, because we pre-collect in many cases, so we got I think 100,000 organizations already pre-collected in the platform. And so if we have that information, we'll just share it with you and give it to you. And if you'd like, if we don't have your organization, you can click a button and we'll collect on your email domain. And we sort of ask that you go through the trial process to add additional seeds into it, just because like we had a few Russians showing up scanning Russian banks, which, that's great. But
happens.
From time to time,
Russians are going to Russian.
And so you can do that. You can use the host platform, or if you wish, through that process, we can also just send you to the open engine, which is at core.intrigue.io. And there's a bunch of like blog posts and stuff there that you can read about and kind of like understand more about how the engine works. So if you're more on the pen tester, technical side, I would say go with the open side, go with the open engine. If you're more just like, hey, I want results from my organization, I would say go to the hosted platform, or do both.
Awesome. Jonathan, thank you so much for appearing on Enterprise Security Weekly. We'll certainly continue to keep tabs on what you got going on over at Intrigue, and I encourage our listeners to go check it out.
Awesome. Thanks, Paul.
Thanks, Jonathan. With that, we'll take a short break. Sunil Yu from YL Ventures coming up next. Stay tuned.